Thank you so much, Carl, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
You seem to be one of the most banned men in the British media at the moment.
I'm actually not very banned. I don't tend to court media attention, though, because it's actually not very nice being in the eye of the storm.
Certainly when Liz Truss did an interview with your colleague, she got a huge amount of pushback and criticism for that, because your colleague is associated with you, and you said a crass joke a few years ago about Jess Phillips. You said, "I wouldn't even rape her."
That's correct.
Would you like to apologise for those comments?
Yes. I think the situation in which that sort of thing, there's been a real change in British politics recently. And Jess Phillips herself, I think, really highlighted this at her acceptance speech for her victory in the latest election, in which she pointed out that there's been severe coarsening in British politics. And honestly, it really struck a chord with me, because I felt that, well, that's obviously true. She was putting on a very brave face about these things, and in other media interviews afterwards, she explained that, or she was trying to explain that she wasn't intimidated. But I think it was evident that she was, because there seems to be a really hard edge underneath British politics now that didn't exist back when I was being very rude to Miss Phillips. The issue has been the injection of foreign sectarian politics and the liberal principles that underpinned British political life no longer obtain. When I insulted Jess Phillips, and I was horrifically rude, and I'll properly apologise for that in a minute, it was against the background of stable English political life, in which it was obvious to everyone involved that when she was calling me various names, like a misogynist or whatever, and I was insulting towards her, it was evident that it was only just going to be words. That's all it was ever going to be. And I don't think that's evident with what's happening now, and I'm really concerned about it. And I think that both myself and Jess have contributed to this atmosphere of political coarsening. And it occurred to me in around 2022, after a conversation I had with Peter Hitchens on the subject, that actually maybe I should apologise to her, because he had pointed out that it doesn't matter whether she accepts it or not. Because one of the reasons I haven't apologised yet is because I genuinely thought she would just throw it back in my face. But Peter pointed out that it doesn't matter if she does. What matters is that it's the right thing to do to unconditionally apologise. And I've personally been through a long period of growth and reflection. I've become a father many times over. I've got myself a good education now, and I'm a business owner. And I look around now at the man I was then, and I think about the man I am now, and all of the responsibilities that I have, and the kind of social fabric we're living in. And I realize that, yes, I was contributing to this. So it is without any kind of reservation that I'd like to say that I am sorry to Jess Phillips, and I shouldn't have made such a rude and obviously offensive statement. And if she would like me to apologise in person, I'm more than happy to do so. And I'm not going to explain, what, or make any kind of excuse for that. It was just wrong, and I shouldn't have done it. And I'd like to, frankly, present a better example to my sons as they grow older.
You had, and still have, a large influence online. Particularly a lot of young people watched your videos on YouTube, going through that whole Gamergate scandal and anti-feminist content, and hundreds of thousands and millions of people watching this stuff. So you had a responsibility, I suppose, to those young viewers to be civil and to sort of show an example to them. Do you think you kind of let them down in a way?
Well, not really. In the same way that I was describing the stability of English political life, it was the same thing with online discourse. It was very inflammatory, but it was always understood to just be words. And this was not an aspect of British life that was actually very controversial. And it was it was only in the most recent years where we've seen spikes in political violence. I mean, I myself was milkshaked on the campaign trail. Nigel Farage, various others have been milkshaked. And this moves the political discourse into a dimension that I think actually everyone should be very concerned about. Especially, I mean, if it's just party politics and that's happening, that's concerning. But when it becomes very deeply held, sincere sectarian convictions, like over the Israel-Palestine issue, I think this is where we really need cooler heads to prevail. And now it becomes really imperative to set the good example for other people. I will be polite to Jess Phillips in future. I'm not going to be rude to her at all. And I do hope she accepts my apology in the spirit with which it's been presented.
Some of your fans would say, Carl, you're caving in to the media. This is what the left want to do. They want to hound you out until you apologize, to kind of cancel you, and you're simply surrendering to them. What do you make of that argument?
I think that it's pretty obvious that I haven't surrendered to media hounding. Otherwise, I would have done this years earlier. Because I made this joke originally in 2016. So I think that that's not the issue on the table. And I think that it doesn't matter what they say or do. I think Peter Hitchens is right that we should be the people who are setting the example. We should be the people who our audiences can look at and say, no, that is a virtuous man that I'm watching. That is someone who I actually can look up to and respect on his own terms. Nobody has asked me to do this. This is something that I've come to the conclusion on my own because I think it's the right thing to do.
Some again would say that the left hate you. Jess Phillips is an enemy. There's a friend-enemy distinction. This has become a very popular, I suppose, meme amongst online kind of right-wingers. And yet you're just caving into your enemy.
I don't think so. I don't know whether Jess Phillips will accept my apology or not. And in one way, it doesn't matter that much if she doesn't. It's for me that I'm doing this. It's not really for her, but it is also for her, of course. And like I said, if she'd like to meet in person and have me apologize in person, I'm more than happy to do that. The issue is we are the custodians of the quality and the coarseness or not of our political discourse. And it's obvious that it's become frayed to the point of being almost useless. And I would like to do what I can to try and salvage it.
You mentioned earlier that you were assaulted through this milkshake when you were standing, was it for Parliament? Or for the European Parliament for UKIP. And obviously we have Sir David Amos, the MP who was killed by an Islamic extremist. Obviously Joe Cox as well, who was murdered by a kind of far-right man as well. So it seems that MPs really are under a threat of physical violence in a way that perhaps we haven't seen since the Troubles.
Yeah, this became very apparent to me in I think it's February this year, where Lindsay Hoyle was clearly and evidently agitated about the safety of parliamentarians. And this is something, Jess Phillips has personally lost a close friend because of political violence. And to make sure that people can feel safe in their own political discourse, we do have to have a certain level of civility that I had crossed. And I had done it before we'd got to this point, but I think that I can do my part to start putting it back together. I think that's the right thing to do.
I want to ask about the threat of Islamic extremism and Islamic violence in Britain, and particularly in British politics. Do you think that this has been, this kind of threat level has risen in recent years, and why do you think that is?
I think the threat of an individual terror attack is not as high as it used to be, but there is a general, and I don't have a better word for it other than just a general level of sectarianism that has increased because of mass immigration. We have been indiscriminate with the kinds of people we've allowed into the country, the Conservative Party has been indiscriminate about the kinds of people they've let into the country. And we have assumed that they're all basically the same and they're in some way like us. And it turns out that actually they're all very different from one another, and some of them are just not like us at all. And now we find ourselves essentially held hostage to very angry gangs of men. And this is why I think there was a genuine fear in Phillips' face when she was explaining what had happened to her recently. Because when you have large, loud, and illiberal men shouting at you, well, they've already stalked her, they've already intimidated her, they've slashed one of her campaigners' tires. I mean, this is just too far. I have to say, on a personal level, I am worried for Jess Phillips' safety because her constituency is 40% Muslim, and it only takes one person to take the Israel-Palestine issue too far, and something terrible could happen. And so I wanted to at least have my peace made with all of this. But I think we've really crossed the Rubicon, to be honest.
This issue of Israel-Palestine seems to have ignited a rage amongst many British Muslims, also liberals, left-wing, white young people as well. How do we, as a country, move beyond this conflict in Israel and Palestine? How do we unite again, and how do we sort of cool the emotions?
Right.
I'm not terribly sure there is a civil solution to the issue. Both sides have legitimate moral claims that the other side denies, and until both sides can be ready to admit that there are legitimate moral claims on the other side, then the situation can never be resolved or have any kind of accord being made.
Well,
on the left, they are wrong to say that Hamas is not a terrorist group. They are wrong to say that October the 7th didn't happen or was somehow deserved by Israel. As we saw some quite mainstream commentators and journalists for, say, Novara Media just openly come out and say, quite flippantly in some ways as well. But on the other side, it is true that Israel appears to have gone too far. It is true that Israel appears to have created more problems than it has solved in its response. And I think that, I'm not an expert on the subject, but it strikes me that they should have been more surgical with their response. And this has given life to the left's claims, which would have been more tactically sound not to have breathed life into.
But interestingly enough, from many people's perspective, this is a war happening many miles away. What has this got to do with English domestic politics? And particularly it dominated various local constituency elections in the recent general election. We have, I think, 5 independent MPs who were elected on this issue of Gaza. You had Jeremy Corbyn and others saying, I am the man for Gaza. Vote for me because I'm supporting Gaza, not vote for me because I'm supporting Britain. Yeah. Do you think we're going to see more of these foreign conflicts, foreign wars, ethno-religious conflicts dominating local British politics following mass immigration?
I think it's inevitable. I mean, it's ironic that the native British concerns that Mr. Brexit, Nigel Farage, has put into the public discourse are as well represented as Gazan concerns in the British Parliament. We are, of course, going to see, I was going to say we're going to see more independent Muslim MPs campaigning on a platform of Gaza, the larger the Islamic community grows. But I think actually what they'll do is follow the example of Belgium and just start an Islamic party that will be the party for the Islamified areas of the country. Because, and again, the Conservatives have just been utterly irresponsible with the way they handled mass immigration. They just allowed people to congregate in areas to create a kind of nexus and majority of a particular kind of alien political system. And they are entitled to use democracy just like anyone else is. So it was inevitable that they would end up forming these kind of sectarian parties. And we're going to see it for other communities too. Already you can see the Hindu community coming out and saying, well, look, if they're going to be doing that, when we can't just keep voting Conservative our whole lives, we're going to need active Hindu interests and parties who are going to work for us against the sectarian politics. And so we've brought the India-Pakistan conflict into our own shores. I don't know why we've done it. I don't know why they thought this was a good idea, but it's with us now and we have to deal with it.
In terms of the solution to mass immigration, I know many Conservative voters feel completely betrayed on this issue. The Conservatives promised one thing, and they flooded the country with immigrants on the other hand. How do you sort of see the Conservative, with a small c, solution to the issue of mass immigration moving forward, maybe even the next 5, 10, 20 years?
I think the best plan is to analyse the actual situation as it is. So at the moment, mass immigration is only really a problem because the Conservatives essentially have no desire to impose any kind of control of the borders. So they let in something like 1.2, 1.4, 1.5 million people every year, and there is a net outflow, there's an outflow of somewhere between 600 to 800,000 people every year, which creates the net inflow of around 750,000 people, again, rough figures. I think if we were to simply stop the inflow, then the net outflow would still carry on. I don't think there's any reason to think that would stop. And so the country, which at the moment feels massively overpopulated, if you ever try to use a service or purchase a house or drive a car, that will start to feel less and less overpopulated over time, as there is a natural sort of drainage of people who simply just choose to leave the United Kingdom. And I think 10 years of zero immigration in and just allow the immigration out to do its own work will make the country feel like it's in a much more balanced equilibrium than it was under the Conservatives, and probably will be under Labour.
Some others argue that you can remove the incentives for people to come here, and when people are here, you can remove certain like welfare benefits and social housing and so on, and that might cause more emigration. I don't know, that might be what part of that solution. I want to ask about reform though. I know that you've been involved in kind of populist politics. We mentioned earlier that you even stood for the European Parliament elections a few years ago. Do you think that we should have faith as conservative people, as conservative voters, in reform? Do you think reform is the solution to the Conservative Party's problem?
I think reform is not yet the solution, but it could become the solution. The best thing about it is it begins within a quite authentically British paradigm. We're not revolutionaries. We don't want to overthrow the state. We don't want to get rid of our glorious country. But we do want to change it to suit the times. And so reform is a very strong branding and message. The issue I've found is that Nigel Farage is too much in campaign mode. Now, it's not, I think, something to blame him for. Nigel Farage is a superb campaigner, as I think the result in the recent election shows. To get 5 seats in the first past the post system with 4 million votes, everyone is complaining, well, if only we had proportional representation. It's like, well, it actually, I think, really highlights the juggernaut that Nigel Farage has summoned up out of the British public, and that there is a real appetite for where he's going. And so Nigel now has legitimised himself. He was right. He won the Brexit vote, and now he's in Parliament on the strength of the anti-immigration vote. He's right, he knows he's right, and everyone else knows he's right, and they should really start listening, but they're not going to. And so now what this means is that he needs to move, I think, into what I would just term the sort of statesman mode. He can stop fighting people. He's won the arguments. He's won all of these arguments. Now he can begin persuading people and winning over people who otherwise might not have been natural voters of him, but explaining to them, look, it really is the source of all of the major problems that Britain has at the moment. It stems back to simply demand, excess demand. And if you want the NHS to be saved, for example, well, you're going to have to make sure it's just a national service and not an international service. If you want your children or grandchildren to have houses, well, you're going to have to make sure that foreign peoples aren't able to buy them. Why is that the case? There are lots and lots and lots of strong arguments. And I think that in the next few years, Nigel will be able to professionalise reform. I think they'll be able to really come up with a very, very good manifesto, very well-written agenda, and promote it very effectively. And I think it will be very persuasive to the British public. I think he's really got a shot in 2029 of flipping the entire table over, the uniparty consensus between Labour and the Conservatives. And the reason I think this is because of Labour's reaction to reform. There are only 5 MPs, and yet since the election, I have not heard a single Labour politician talk about the Conservatives. They do not care. They have conquered that party. But Nigel Farage is an insurgent force, and they can see it. He's dangerous to them. He is already the second party in the north, and they know it. And after 5 years of Keir Starmer's internationalist, metropolitan, upper middle class management of this country, why would a single working class northerner even think about voting for them? He's just going to be against their interests, whereas Farage, well, he's going to be their guy.
You were a supporter of the Zero Seats campaign. That was the campaign to try and destroy the Conservative Party. It didn't work. They got 121 seats. Do you think that Zero Seats campaign should keep on going to 2029? Do you think that goal is achievable? Do you still support that 0 seats for the Conservatives?
100%. And it seems that the Conservatives support 0 seats for the Conservatives. The Conservative Party is completely captured by Liberal Democrats, essentially. People who like the maybe clubbable nature of being a Conservative, but hold absolutely zero Conservative principles. Everyone is well aware that at this point it is Nigel Farage who is the legitimate leader of the British right. Everyone can see this. And the energy, the mandate of heaven that comes with it, it's with him. There isn't a single person in the Conservative Party that any Conservative wants leading the Conservative Party. The fact that the Tory wets still call the shots in the Conservative Party is incredible. And to be honest with you, is just going to lead to their demise. This was a surprise for them, and for some reason they've learned the wrong lesson.
Will Kemi Badenoch save the Tory party?
No.
Why? She's meant to be this right-wing, anti-trans, brilliant black conservative.
And when challenged the other day, she was very quick to pull out identity politics. It's intrinsic in the Conservatives themselves that they are essentially the slow-moving wing of the left. Nigel Farage is not the slow-moving wing of the left. And so that's where real conservatism lies.
I want to ask about Zoomers. There was a lot of discourse before the election that Reform is doing well with 16, 17-year-olds in certain opinion polls. Maybe it's kind of hard to gauge that demographic, I don't know. I know that between 18 and 24, in terms of people who are voting in the general election, I think Reform got only 8%. Maybe the Tories got 12%, something like that. So do you think there is a significant rise in conservatism among Zoomers and particularly among Zoomer young men?
I think it's notable, but not necessarily significant. From a voting perspective, the problem with having young people as your voting base is that they're just far less inclined to vote by almost a factor of 2 to 1 over people in older demographic cohorts. So even if they are dispositionally inclined towards you, well, if they don't get to the polls, then it doesn't really matter that much, does it? But on a more long-term scale, I think it's a superb thing that this happened, because these people will, of course, grow older and more worldly wise and more, I was going to say conservative, but that's not the right word, more mature and responsible, and they will consider themselves more engaged with the political process, I would imagine. But the question that a lot of people seem to be asking themselves is, well, why is this happening? Why are they going right wing? And the answer to that is because there isn't any light at the end of the tunnel. That's why. You've put them on rails and said, right, we're going down this dark tunnel and we're going forever, and it's never going to get any better. They're never going to get a good job. They're never going to get a house. They're never going to become the family people that they would like to be. They're having their future stolen from them. And it's right that they should look and say, well, why would I care what Labour or the Conservatives have to say if all they can promise me is a stolen future? Anyone else will do. And luckily, they've actually got some half-decent alternatives. I mean, people can have any critique of Nigel Farage they like, but he's not a deeply irresponsible man. He's not crazy. He's not an extreme, scary Nazi or fascist or anything of the sort. He's a British patriot. His heroes are Winston Churchill. He's, at worst, a Thatcherite. And worse, that's not an irresponsible or oppressive or malignant kind of politician. He's not driven by resentment. That's the thing. And a lot of people, I think, are really concerned about the Labour Party, which does seem to be driven by resentment. There seems to be a deep well of malice within it. And this, I think, we're going to see coming out in the next couple of years.
It's interesting you talk about resentment. And I know that in recent years, not particularly recently now, it seems to have been completely out of the discourse, but the media were obsessed with this group called Incels. And maybe they associated you with that. I'm not saying you personally, but your the kind of connection that you had with young men online, and that kind of so-called misogynistic, movement. Or, I'm not saying it is, but that's what that's how the media described it. What happened to the incels? Why aren't we talking about them anymore?
Well, I think that I think it's really funny that the left's arch enemy are what I would have called virgins at school. I mean, sorry, why are we picking on it? It's hard to find people who are more low status in society than men who are unable to get wives and girlfriends. It's a really harsh place to be, I would imagine. I'm married with 4 kids, so it's not something I've had to struggle with. But, being at school and being called a virgin is not fun when you're a teenage boy, because of course you're a virgin, you're a teenage boy. Yeah. And so the fact that these have become the boogeyman of feminist politics, left-wing politics, it shows the preposterous nature of their own position. Because I do think you can judge a man by his enemies. And if they're your prime enemy, well, that's very interesting and revealing about you. And also, why aren't we more sympathetic to this, actually? I do think that it is part of the telos of a human life to get married and have children. And so it's totally normal for young men to want to get married and have children, and that requires them to get girlfriends. And if for some reason they can't, it seems like a genuine civilizational question that we have to answer. Why can our young guys not get married?
Or even get girlfriends. And this issue it's interesting because we've got the rise of dating apps, which seems to have not helped dating whatsoever. Certainly, I think there's some stats, something like 70 to 80% of people, that's like their primary mode of dating and finding a girlfriend amongst younger generations. So do you think that basically we've got this crisis of dating or romance in 2024 where people are just scrolling through apps and that's the only way you can find people?
I'm so glad it's not my problem. I'm so glad I'm married that I don't have to endure this. I can only imagine how difficult it is for these people. The problem that we have is that in every prior age, the selection of people you could go out with was limited by your geography. And now you can find thousands of people within a 10-mile radius who match some fairly broad criteria. And this gives everyone the ability to swipe. And what are we doing? We're not talking about what it is to actually be a human being. Like, the problem I have with dating apps is the fact that people list a series of characteristics about themselves and a series of desired characteristics in their partners, as if that's what dating is about. No, what you're trying to do is find someone with whom you will fall in love and produce this kind of unbreakable connection where they are just constantly on the top of your mind because your soul won't stop throbbing for them. A list of characteristics on a dating app, you may as well just go shopping. You're just on Amazon at this point looking for a product. We've commodified what it is to be in love, and so I'm not surprised that nobody's finding love out of these things. There's nothing spiritual or romantic about any of this. And I just think about the way I met my wife. We were in the same building, basically. She spotted me, obviously took a liking to me and just sort of smiled at me. I smiled back because I was like, oh, she's good looking. And then she sent a friend over with her number and, the rest of history. It's nothing to do with a dating app or anything like that. It's about a kind of spark that you have when you first meet someone. And I'm not surprised you're not getting that off of the dating apps. You don't know what you're doing, get off of them, get out in the real world.
But the social consequences as well as the political consequences of this is significant, right? I mean, fertility rates are declining. That's a civilizational question. I've already mentioned the kind of incel phenomenon as much as it is a phenomenon. And it's interesting that you've seen the rise of certain figures in recent years who the media loves to talk about. Andrew Tate, he is hugely significant, millions of followers, tens of millions of followers. He really is a phenomenon on the internet. Jordan Peterson, same thing. And to probably a lesser extent, maybe you, Carl. So do you feel that, it's your responsibility to connect with these young men, to be compassionate with them, to guide them in the right direction? Do you feel kind of a moral, motivation partly through what you're doing with the Lotus Eaters, which is just to explain, your online platform, which you have on YouTube and so on?
I don't know if I necessarily view it as a moral responsibility. I think it's an inevitability, given the status of the civilization at the moment. I mean, I'm a man, I'm concerned about the state of masculinity, and I have 2 sons who I want to also grow into masculine men. And so this sort of thing naturally triangulates itself around you. You can't help but engage with these subjects because they are, as you say, these are civilizational issues, and they are just not addressed with an ear of compassion by the mainstream at all. In fact, whenever you hear a mainstream journalist, and often she'll be a woman, talk about these issues, it's with a kind of cold heart and a callous tongue, where she will condemn these young men as if they've done something wrong. It's like, you're condemning teenagers. You're condemning teenage boys who can't get a date. Is there something wrong with you? Can't we be a bit more compassionate towards them? I don't think we should be condemning young women for being addicted to Instagram or anything like that. We should be compassionate to them too. These are the problems that we have created for our young people, and we're acting like they should already be adults and have the answers to these questions, which of course they don't. And there's no instruction manual. This is all brand new. We can't. There are no traditional solutions to which we can fall back on here, because this is well outside of the wheelhouse of anything that's come before.
I suppose those journalists and some would definitely criticize these young men because they would say they're misogynistic, they're bigoted, they're radicalized, they're racist, because they may be saying things on online forums that are trolling people or saying really nasty comments, and they basically view this group of people as totally beyond the pale for all the reasons I've just mentioned. So how do we engage with people who have been kind of radicalized, I guess, in a way? And look, I'm not saying everyone, but there is definitely a group of people on the internet who have gone down bad paths. I think the Tate route is certainly a bad path for them to go down. I can understand why they're attracted to that, but how do we sort of de-radicalize these people?
I think the problem is in framing them as radicals in the first place. I actually don't think that teenagers and men in their 20s have a particularly sophisticated political development or outlook. I think that we're giving them too much credit when we say this. But the problem that we have is that we put far too much stock in what an idea is rather than the lived practice of the idea. We never speak about virtue anymore. We never speak about the actual good things that people do, the habits of life that make you a good person. Being a good person is not in holding an opinion. It is in every day getting up and making sure your kids go to school, making sure that they've got dinner on the table, a roof over their heads, making sure they have cuddles with you, making sure they feel loved, helping them solve their problems, being there when they're hurt, and knowing when to back off and let them go on an adventure when it's appropriate for them to do so. All of these things are just part of the simple and unchampioned virtues of family life, but they are the bedrock of everything that we take for granted. And so if we spoke more about this and about maybe dating and courting and how actually there are other ways to get women's attention than simply being angry and resentful online, then we could actually start solving the problem. But this requires the feminist media, shall I say, that is constantly condemning them, to stop it. It's not appropriate. You're victimizing what are essentially children.
And they're having the opposite effect. They're probably pushing them even further down their own paths. Like one would imagine, if you're accused of something, sometimes you might revel in it. And I know that particularly in America, amongst the kind of young conservative movement, there's this, certainly people make the argument that if I call you a fascist enough times, or far right, or a Nazi, sometimes some people are going to say, okay, maybe I am. Maybe I am a Nazi. Maybe I am far right. and they revel in it, and they become the kind of enemy that the media has painted them as.
Well, it diffuses the attack. There's no point accusing a fascist of being a fascist. So they shouldn't say, okay, well,
who cares?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, big deal. You're a communist, and you shrug that off. So yeah, there is absolutely an aspect of it. But the problem is we're falling into a dialectic there that allows them to keep winning the argument. Whereas if we were to change the discussion, say, well, okay, so do you want these young men to become responsible adults who are the pillars, the backbone of society, who are the net taxpayers, who are the people you call upon when there's an accident in the street? Somebody come and help. There's a guy trying to steal my purse. Well, who exactly are you expecting to call upon? Do you think that some kid who's been called an incel his whole life, but is 6'2", and is capable of fighting off that mugger, do you think he's coming to your aid now because he feels enfranchised in your society? You've made him feel like he's not a part of this. So it's not surprising that he's not going to rush to your aid. No, we need to make them feel that they're our young men. No, you have a role in this society. You're guarding the borders. That's what you do.
Interestingly enough, you've actually got in trouble with some conservatives for talking kind of on the opposite spectrum of this and saying that actually conservatives online have a problem with women, and they've kind of gone too anti-feminist in some ways. So can you just talk a bit about that, the other side of these?
Yeah, so there is and I have to say it's more American men, I've noticed, young American men, who have created an ideology around women of their own, in the same way that feminists have created an ideology around men. Say, well, all men are evil and oppressive, and therefore. And I've noticed in the past few years that there's definitely been a tendency to think that women have to be quote-unquote submissive. Now, my wife is a housewife. I earn the money. She does the house stuff. There's never, it wouldn't even cross my mind to call her submissive, because she's not. She's an English woman who knows her mind and knows exactly what she wants and gets exactly what she wants. But I'm still the head of the household, and I'm still the one who says no when I don't want to spend that money on something that she wants. This kind of ideological view of a woman as a kind of domestic slave, again, it comes from the commodification of what a person is, because these men have spent their time not interacting with women properly, but drawing up a laundry list of characteristics that they want and turning their ideal dream trad wife into sort of domestic servant, which is just inappropriate. She's meant to be the woman that you love and cherish, and it's meant to be a very warm and cozy feeling that you have in your heart for her, not a list of demands like she's a paid cleaner. This is a problem, and I think it's probably understandable this has happened, but it's definitely something that I think people need to grow out of.
I know that you've been studying philosophy recently. This is an area where I'm painfully ignorant, and I'm shameful to say that. But can you just talk a bit about perhaps some of the lessons from philosophy that younger people perhaps could take from history, from sort of ancient Greek philosophy and so on? Do you think there are any lessons that we can learn from those people?
Oh, 100%. I recently finished a degree from the University of London, Birkbeck, which is Roger Scruton's college, in philosophy. And it has opened my eyes to many things. And people always ask me, well, why did you do it? And I say, well, honestly, to better understand my own thoughts on things. Because sometimes you become very frustrated that you know what you're trying to say, but you can't properly articulate it. But to answer your question directly, Aristotle, I think, is the first and best place to begin. For 1,000 years, he was just called the philosopher, because his theory of virtue ethics actually has a comprehensive view for what a human life should be. What you should be doing with your time. Because one of the problems that the left and the conservatives have arrived at is they can tell you what not to do, but they can't tell you what you ought to do. People always are asking me, what should I be doing? It's like, well, okay, well, what do you do? It's like, well, I'm a single young person. It's like, okay, well, you should be trying to find a girlfriend who you're going to make a wife to start a family with, and a lot of them are quite young and say, well, that's off the table for me because of the way I live. And it's like, okay, phone your mum. Your mum wants to hear from you. That's what you ought to do, just right now. Just literally turn off the interview, pick up the phone and go, "Hi, Mum, how are you?" She'll be thrilled to hear from you. It'll be a wonderful surprise. You'll make her day, and then you can have a nice chat with her for an hour, and you'll realize that you've made the world in a very small and incremental way, a better place than it was 5 minutes ago. And it cost you nothing. It took very little of your time. And if you do that once a week, you'll find that your relationship with your mum is really good. Go to the bar with your dad, once a month. He'll love it. He'll be thrilled. He'll tell you about boring sports ball stories or something like that. And by the end of it, he'll feel really good. You can just do small things to make the world a better place. And this is essentially what I've decided the philosophy boils down to, because almost all of liberal philosophy is total nonsense. Almost all of it is total nonsense. It begins in nonsense premises, it arrives at ridiculous conclusions, and it has very suspect methods to arrive at these places. And this is why left-wing politics is just ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. They're trying to fit many square pegs into lots of round holes, and it's not working, and nobody believes the lies that they're telling now. And these scales are falling away from people's eyes, and people looking around going, okay, well, what else is there? It's like, okay, well, there is traditional human morality that you grew up with, and it's very relational, and this is why you should give your mum a ring.
Certainly in the States, less so in Britain, conservatives are incredibly Christian, and they view the answer to your question as, what you should do in your life and so on through that lens, through Christianity, and that kind of explains everything, and, that should be your guiding philosophy. I believe you're not a Christian, yet you still have conservative tendencies, you think about philosophy and so on. Do you think there's a bit of a contradiction between your conservatism and your lack of faith, your lack of Christianity? I know that Christianity has kind of formed a Western civilization, and we want to defend that as it is today. So do you see a contradiction there?
No, not really. I'm sure that my traditional life would be enriched by Christianity, but I don't want to do anything inauthentically. I was raised in the 80s and 90s in a materialistic country that had no spiritual underpinnings really left. And I was never taken to church as a child or anything, so I don't have any nostalgia for it. And so it's not something that gnaws at my soul. But I think that it's entirely appropriate for the American Christians and British Christians to promote Christianity. This is the traditional religion of the West, and it is morally very, very functional. It's a good religion. It's got good moral teachings in it. Even from a secular perspective, you can say, well, Jesus was a jolly good fellow, He's a good example to other people, and actually he's got some points about they turning the other cheek, not beginning blood libels, not taking revenge, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. There are lots and lots of timeless moral precepts in Christianity. And if, again, as you say, my advice was, well, ring your mum. In America, it would probably well go to church. And that's perfectly good advice. Every Christian I've ever met has been a lovely, compassionate, considerate person. There are lots of atheists I've met who are not that way. And so...
But you don't think that conservatives necessarily have to be Christian, and you think that, it sounds like you think that you can live your life in a moral way, and you can, make good decisions and so on in a traditional way without necessarily going to church or believing in God and so on.
Oh, 100%. I mean, the expressions of what we do have the tone in which we imbue with them. So if I want to take my children to the park or something like that on a Sunday morning, or I take them to a church on a Sunday morning, it's still a good family gathering where we're getting good time together, and we're spending that time in a wholesome and nourishing and enriching way. So even if you're not Christian, you should live a traditional conservative life because it's good for the people around you. And that's really what I think the issue really boils down to. You're moving out of love and not resentment. You're moving in a way that is wholesome and good and builds something. You're building relationships with your family instead of destroying them or tethering or fraying the relationships with people. These are the options we've got laid out in front of us in our politics now. And we have to make sure that we are situated from a love of something, a love of country, our love of family, our love of our communities, our love of our way of life, our love of our traditions, our love of our pomp and ceremony, our love of all of the things that we have, rather than a hatred of something foreign.
Now, I don't know if you studied Nietzsche in your course, but Bronze Age Mindset, this kind of book written by a famous, I don't know if you call him conservative, but I'm just explaining to viewers at home, but this is kind of a right-wing modern philosopher, contemporary philosopher, writer, and he has become incredibly popular amongst many conservatives, particularly in the States. And he doesn't like your lifestyle. He wouldn't say that a traditional marriage is the way to go. We should be out adventuring and trying to conquer the world. And I'm probably completely botching what he says, but I've read his book, and it's very, very interesting. But he says basically that you shouldn't be hooked onto some woman, and that's kind of, you're almost like a slave to them in a way. You're being neutered. So what do you think of BAP? What do you think of Nietzsche?
I think that there's always a time and a place for eccentrics. And he is one of these eccentrics. His life is not a long life for other people. His life is a very unusual life for someone who, I believe he has a PhD in philosophy, that is for a certain kind of person with certain kind of characteristics and certain kind of disposition. And we will always need those kinds of men to go out and do exactly what he's suggesting. He should go and do those things. I mean, personally, he should go on, live your authentic life and go and do what you said you want to do, and take your followers, get them to do it, conquer new lands. I think that's a superb idea. But that's always going to be a very small percentage of the population that's interested in doing that. For the rest of us, we need to actually uphold and maintain the civilization, so that once you've gone and conquered, you can come back with the spoils and show us what you've got. So,
thank you so much, Carl, for joining us. Appreciate your time.